The morning Martha Wilcox told Harlan Greer no. She did it so quietly and so firmly that the sound of it seemed to travel across the entire territory of New Mexico like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples out to every ranch house, every saloon, and every dusty crossroads between Silver Creek and the Rio Grande. It was the spring of 1878, and Silver Creek was the kind of town that survived on gossip the way crops survived on rain. There were 400 souls packed into that sun-baked collection of wooden buildings, and every single one of them had an opinion about what Martha Wilcox had done when she looked Harlan Greer straight in the eye and told him she would not be his wife. Not if he were the last man standing in New Mexico territory. Not if the sun itself refused to rise until she said yes. Harlan Greer was, by any measure the town cared to apply, the richest man in the county. He owned the Greer Silver Works, which pulled silver out of the earth at a rate that made men weep with envy. He owned the livery stable, 3 of the 4 commercial lots on Main Street, and a cattle spread that ran 12,000 acres east of the creek. He was 43 years old, thick through the chest, with iron-gray hair and eyes the color of shallow creek water. He was not unkind, but he was accustomed to getting what he wanted, and he had decided he wanted Martha Wilcox. Martha was 26 years old and the daughter of Elias Wilcox, who had come to Silver Creek from Missouri a decade prior with nothing but a wagon, a milk cow, and a determination so fierce it bordered on madness. Elias had built a modest farm 2 miles south of town, and for a while it had been enough. But Elias had died of a lung sickness 3 winters back, leaving Martha and her younger brother Caleb, who was 19, to manage the property alone. The farm produced corn, sweet potatoes, and a small vegetable plot that Martha sold in town on Thursday mornings. It was a spare existence but an honest one, and Martha wore her independence like a second skin. She was not what Silver Creek would have called beautiful in the conventional, delicate sense. She was tall for a woman, with strong hands from years of farm work, and dark brown hair she kept pinned back except when she was working in the fields, when it fell loose around her shoulders in thick waves. Her face was angular, with a jaw that suggested stubbornness and eyes that were an unusual shade of amber that caught the light in ways that made men forget what they had been saying mid-sentence. She was the sort of woman who looked most vivid when she was doing something, when she was hauling water or arguing with the feed merchant over prices or laughing at something her brother said. Harlan Greer had arrived at the Wilcox farm on a Tuesday afternoon in April with his hat in his hands and his proposal prepared. He had rehearsed it, people said later, though nobody could quite explain how they knew this. He had offered Martha security, comfort, a fine house in town, and a future free from the worry of crop failures and drought. He had spoken with the confidence of a man who believed he was delivering good news rather than asking a question. Martha had listened to every word. She had offered him coffee, which he declined. She had waited until he was finished, and then she had said simply that she was grateful for his regard but that she could not accept. She did not explain further, at least not to his satisfaction. She said only that she did not love him and that for her, love was not negotiable. Harlan Greer had looked at her for a long moment. He was not accustomed to rejection, and it sat on him badly, like a coat cut for another man. He put his hat back on, thanked her for her time, and rode back into town, and by sundown the whole of Silver Creek knew what had happened. The opinions that followed were as varied as the people who held them. Clara Bowman, who ran the dry goods store with her husband, said Martha was a fool and would die a spinster. Reverend Aldgate said it was Martha's right and good on her for knowing her own mind. Old Pete Gonzalez, who had worked at the livery for 20 years, said he had always known there was something different about the Wilcox girl, something that would not bend. What nobody in Silver Creek expected was that the story would travel as far as it did. Raymond Slater heard about Martha Wilcox on a Friday evening in a cattle camp 12 miles west of Silver Creek, sitting around a fire with 6 other cowboys who were moving a herd of 200 longhorns north for a rancher named DeWitt. Raymond was 31 years old, lean and weathered in the way that years of outdoor work produced, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had been tanned by 1,000 days of open sky. He had been riding cattle trails and working ranches across Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico since he was 17, and he had accumulated in that time a reputation for being reliable, a skill with horses that bordered on the uncanny, and a personal philosophy that could be summarized as doing the right thing and minding his own business. He was not a man who talked much, which was why the other cowboys were mildly surprised when, upon hearing the story about Martha Wilcox from a man named Cobb who had passed through Silver Creek the week before, Raymond set down his tin cup and asked Cobb to repeat what he had said. Cobb obliged, embellishing slightly in the way that storytellers do, describing how Martha had looked Harlan Greer dead in the eye and sent him packing with nothing but a polite no and an offer of coffee he did not take. The other men laughed and speculated and moved on to other topics. Raymond sat quietly and stared into the fire. "She give a reason?" he asked eventually. Cobb shrugged, said she did not love him. "That is what they say in town. And people think she is a fool for that. Half of them do. She is a farm woman on her own with a young brother to worry about. Greer could have set her up for life." Raymond nodded slowly. He did not say anything else that night, but something about the story lodged in him like a splinter, small and impossible to ignore. There was something in the image of a woman standing in her doorway, comfortable enough in her own self that she could refuse comfort from another person, that struck him as the most honest thing he had heard in a long while. The DeWitt herd arrived at its destination 3 days later, and Raymond collected his pay, a sum of $17.50, and found himself pointing his horse east in the direction of Silver Creek. He told himself he was curious. That was all it was. A man got curious. It was not as though he had a plan. He was between work, and Silver Creek was as good a direction as any, and maybe there was a woman there worth meeting, and maybe there was not, and either way he would find work and move on. That was what he told himself as he rode, and he believed most of it. Silver Creek appeared on the horizon on a warm Wednesday morning in mid-May, shimmering faintly through the dust and heat, a cluster of buildings around a main street that had the look of every other small western town he had ridden into over the years. A general store, a hotel of modest ambition, 2 saloons set strategically on opposite ends of the street, a church whose white paint was beginning to peel in the relentless sun, a blacksmith, and the various attached residences and smaller structures that gathered around these central points like satellites. He rode in slowly, which was his habit, observing without appearing to observe. He stopped at the livery, where old Pete Gonzalez appraised him with the speed and accuracy of a man who had been reading cowboys for decades. Passing through or staying, Pete asked, taking Raymond's horse's bridle with practiced ease. "Staying a while, maybe," Raymond said. "I am looking for work." "You know who is hiring?" Pete pointed down the street. "DeWitt's man was just through, but if you want range work you might try Hendricks out on the north spread. He lost 2 hands to the California gold fever last month and has been short since." Raymond thanked him and paid for a night's stabling. Then he walked his saddle bags down to the hotel, took the cheapest room they had, which was small and hot but had a window that faced the street, and sat on the narrow bed for a moment in the quiet. He was aware that what he was doing was at least partially ridiculous. He had ridden 12 miles out of his way toward a town because of a story he had heard about a woman he had never met. He was a practical man and he knew it, and yet here he was. He went downstairs and ate supper in the hotel dining room, where a woman named Rose served him a plate of beans and salt pork and corn bread, and where the conversation of the other diners drifted over him like smoke. It was at supper that he heard Harlan Greer's name for the second time. 2 merchants were eating at the next table, discussing something about a land assessment, and Greer's name came up in a tone that was a mixture of respect and something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. Raymond listened without appearing to listen, and gathered that Harlan Greer was the kind of powerful man who made other men careful about what they said in public. After supper, he walked down to the less reputable of the two saloons, ordered a glass of whiskey he did not particularly want, and listened to what the room had to say. It was a Thursday, and the following morning was Martha Wilcox's market day, though Raymond did not know that yet. He learned it from a man named Abe Dawson, a ranch hand who was drinking with a kind of committed misery that suggested the night was not going the way he had hoped. Abe, once he determined Raymond was new in town and therefore a fresh audience, was generous with local information. "You should see the Wilcox girl tomorrow morning," Abe said, with the casual authority of a man who considered himself an expert on all local women. "She sets up on the north end of Main Street with vegetables and such. Fine-looking woman, though stubborn as any mule in the territory." "The one who turned down Greer," Raymond said, keeping his voice even. Abe stared at him. "You heard about that already? Word travels." "It does," Abe agreed and shook his head. "Nobody could believe it. Greer is not a man you say no to, generally speaking." "But she did it as cool as you please and sent him on his way. People say she is proud to the point of ruin." "Or she knows her own mind," Raymond said. Abe looked at him strangely. "Could be," he allowed and turned back to his drink. Raymond finished his whiskey and went to bed. He was up at dawn the following morning, a habit of the range that years of town living would not have been able to break even if he had attempted it. He washed his face and combed his hair and told himself, firmly, that he was just going to walk down the main street because there was nothing else to do at this hour. And if there happened to be a woman setting up a vegetable stall, then he would observe her at a reasonable distance like a normal person and determine whether the story he had ridden 12 miles to confirm was as interesting as it had seemed by firelight. He rounded the corner onto Main Street and saw her immediately. She was not hard to miss. She had a flat wagon pulled by a brown mare, and she had set up on the north end of the street just as Abe had said, with neat rows of corn, sweet potatoes, dried beans, and a small selection of early spring greens arranged on boards across the wagon bed. She was wearing a plain blue dress and a wide-brimmed straw hat, and she was arguing with a man Raymond identified as the feed merchant 3 storefronts down, who appeared to be suggesting that her prices were too high, and who was receiving this suggestion very poorly from Martha's end of the exchange. 2 cents a pound is exactly what it was last month, she was saying, in a voice that was clear and firm and carried a warmth underneath its authority that Raymond found immediately interesting. "If the price of feed has gone up, that is not my doing. My corn is priced the same as always." The merchant grumbled and eventually purchased his corn at Martha's price, because there was something in her manner that made haggling feel undignified, and he walked away with his purchase, and the vague sense that he had somehow lost even though he had gotten what he needed. Raymond approached the wagon slowly. Martha was rearranging the sweet potatoes with her back half turned, and she did not see him until he was within speaking distance. "Good morning," he said. She turned and looked at him. The amber eyes that everyone in Silver Creek seemed to have an opinion about were, in person, considerably more striking than any description Raymond had assembled from second-hand accounts. They assessed him with a directness that was neither rude nor particularly welcoming, but simply honest. "Good morning," she replied. "What can I get for you?" "I do not know yet," Raymond said, which was the truth. He had not thought this far ahead. "I am new in town. I was told your corn is the best in the county." Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not quite amusement, but in the neighborhood of it. "Who told you that?" "A man in the saloon last night who seemed to have strong opinions about local produce." "Abe Dawson," she said with a certainty that suggested she had accurately identified the source of most local opinions on most local topics. "He has never bought a single ear of corn from me in his life." "Then I am already ahead of him," Raymond said. That almost amusement firmed into something closer to the real thing. I suppose you are. 2 ears for a penny. He bought 6 ears and a pound of sweet potatoes, which he did not particularly need, and paid her without bargaining, which seemed to surprise her slightly. As she made change from the small tin box she kept under the wagon board, he said, with the careful directness of a man who had decided that the honest approach was the only approach worth taking, I heard about you before I came to Silver Creek. Her hands paused very briefly. Then she finished counting out his change and looked up at him. Did you now? She said, not quite a question. I heard you turn down Harlan Greer. I heard people think you were foolish for it. She held his change out to him and met his eyes with the kind of steadiness that most people had to practice for years and that she appeared to have come by naturally. And what do you think? I think, Raymond said, taking the change, that a person's reasons for saying no to something are their own business. But I found myself curious about the kind of woman who would do it, which is why I am standing here, and I would rather be honest about that than pretend I was just in the market for corn. There was a silence. Main Street was beginning to fill around them, horses and wagons and people going about their Thursday business, and the morning was heating up in the way that New Mexico mornings did in May, steadily and without apology. That is a strange thing to say to someone you have never met, Martha said finally. Yes, Raymond agreed. What is your name? Raymond Slater. I am a ranch hand, most recently for a man named DeVitt out west of here. Before that I was in Colorado. Are you looking for work? I am. I was told to try Hendricks. She nodded once slowly. Hendricks is a fair employer, better than most. She looked at him for a moment longer, the same direct assessment she had applied to everything else that morning, and then said, My name is Martha Wilcox. I know, he said. It was good to meet you. He picked up his corn and his sweet potatoes and walked away down the street, and he did not look back, though he was aware with a certainty that felt like a low hum along his spine that she was watching him go. Martha stood behind her wagon for a long moment after the man named Raymond Slater had disappeared around the corner, and she considered what had just happened. She was not a woman who was easily surprised. Years of managing a farm on her own and dealing with the particular social weather of a small western town had given her a thick crust of composure that most situations could not crack. But something about Raymond Slater had been unexpected. It was not his appearance, though he was not unpleasant to look at. It was the directness, the fact that he had simply said what he was there for rather than maneuvering around it. In her experience, men generally approached her with one of two strategies. They either pretended to want something mundane and hoped the pretense would ease them towards something less mundane, or they announced their interest in the loud, performative way that was really just pride in a disguise. This man had done neither. He had simply told her the truth about why he was standing at her wagon, and then he had bought his corn and left. She found it remarkable. She found it, in a way she would not have admitted to anyone, slightly alarming. She sold out her stock by mid-morning, loaded the empty wagon boards, and drove back to the farm with her brother Caleb, who had been helping her pack up and had watched the whole exchange with Raymond Slater with the bright attentiveness of someone who had nothing better to do. Who was that? Caleb asked as they drove south on the farm road. A ranch hand looking for work, Martha said. He talked to you for a while. People talk to me. I sell things. Caleb considered this for a moment. He was 19 and had an open, amiable face and the kind of shrewd awareness that younger siblings develop from years of watching older ones. He did not buy that much corn. No, Martha agreed. And he did not haggle. No, most men haggle. I noticed. Caleb looked at her profile for a moment and then, wisely, said nothing more. Raymond rode out to the Hendricks spread the following morning and presented himself to Daniel Hendricks, who was a compact, brisk man in his 50s with a rancher's permanently squinting assessment of weather and men. He asked Raymond about his experience, watched him work with a horse for 5 minutes, and offered him a bunk and a wage of $22 a month, which was reasonable. Raymond accepted and settled into the rhythms of range work with the ease of long practice. Hendricks ran a cattle operation, primarily steers bound for the rail yards in Santa Fe, and the daily work was the familiar combination of riding, roping, mending fence, managing water sources, and the 100 small mechanical repairs that kept a working ranch functional. He was good at all of it, and Hendricks noticed, and the other ranch hands, a weathered collection of men of various backgrounds, accepted him in the practical, unsentimental way of working men who cared more about whether you could pull your weight than where you had come from. He thought about Martha Wilcox with a regularity that he found both unavoidable and slightly embarrassing. He thought about the way she had looked at him, the weight of that amber gaze, and the quality of her stillness when she was listening, like a person who had learned that most things worth knowing came from paying attention. He thought about the way she had said his change with that brief pause when he had told her he had come because of the story about Harlan Greer, the brief moment where she had to readjust to something she had not expected. He rode into Silver Creek on Sunday afternoon, which was his day off, with no particular plan. He went to the dry goods store for tobacco and a new pair of work gloves. He stopped at the hotel for a meal. He walked the length of Main Street and back, thinking. And then, because there was no point in being indirect with himself, he rode south on the farm road and stopped at the Wilcox property. It was a modest place. A frame house in need of paint, a solid barn that was in better repair than the house, a good-sized vegetable garden beside the house that showed the marks of careful tending, 2 fields of corn in different stages of growth, and a small pen where 3 hogs moved with the comfortable indifference of animals who had never had reason to worry. The whole operation had the look of a place that was held together by determination and constant work rather than by ease. Martha was in the garden when he rode up, and she straightened and looked at him across the fence with that same clear gaze. She was wearing a practical gray dress and her hair was down because she had been working, and she had a hoe in her hands that she did not put down when he dismounted and tied his horse to the post at the gate. "Mr. Slater," she said. "Miss Wilcox," he said. "I hope I am not intruding." "That depends on what you want," she said, with a straightforwardness that matched his own from their first meeting. "I would like to talk to you if you have the time. I could come back another day if this is not convenient." She considered him for a moment. Then she said, "Give me a few minutes to finish this row," and went back to hoeing. He waited by the fence and watched her work with an efficiency and economy of motion that spoke of years of repetition. She did not perform for him or hurry or slow down. She simply finished what she was doing, put the hoe against the garden fence post, and came out through the gate, wiping her hands on her apron. "Come and sit on the porch," she said. The porch was a simple affair, 2 chairs and a small table, and the view from it was the flat New Mexico landscape stretching out to the mountains in the west, beautiful in the way that empty things are beautiful, with a bigness that required no embellishment. Caleb appeared briefly in the doorway, assessed the situation with rapid and efficient curiosity, and was dispatched back inside by a single look from his sister. "You found work at Hendricks?" she asked when they were seated. "I did. He is a fair employer, as you said." "He is." She folded her hands in her lap. "You rode out here on your day off to talk, so talk." Raymond looked out at the mountains for a moment. He was not a man who was afraid of silence, but he was aware that what he was about to say required some care, not because he wanted to be indirect, but because he wanted to be accurate. "I told you when we met that I came to Silver Creek because of the story about you and Greer," he said. "What I did not tell you was why that story affected me the way it did. I have been on the road since I was 17 years old, and I have worked every kind of ranch and trail in 3 territories, and I have met a great many people. Most of them, when they are faced with a choice between what is practical and what they actually want, choose the practical. Not because they are cowards, but because wanting something you cannot name feels less real than a silver mine and a house in town. You chose the thing you could not name, I found that remarkable. Martha was very still. She looked at him steadily. "What is it you think I chose?" she asked. "I think you chose the right to love on your own terms, to not be purchased, even at a generous price." She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the corn rows, and the sound of it was like a distant conversation. "Most people in this town think I chose foolishness," she said. "Most people in this town have not made a decision in a long time that did not have a practical explanation," Raymond said. She looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read, and then slowly she almost smiled. It was not quite a smile yet, but it was on its way to becoming one. "You are a stranger," she said. "You know nothing about me." "That is true," he said. "I know that you grow good corn and that you charge fair prices and that you do not back down from merchants who think they should get a discount because you are a woman alone. I know that you are the kind of person who finishes her work before she sits down for a conversation. And I know that you said no to a man who could have solved a good many of your practical problems because his solution was not the right one. Beyond that, I am hoping to learn." She looked at him for a very long time after that. He did not look away and he did not fidget. He simply waited, which he had the feeling was the right thing to do. "Why are you telling me all of this?" she asked finally. "Because I think I would like to court you properly," he said. "And I thought the honest thing was to say so, and then let you decide whether that is something you are willing to consider." Martha Wilcox stood up from her chair and walked to the porch railing and stood looking out at the corn fields for a long moment, and Raymond waited. "You have been in Silver Creek for less than a week," she said. "Yes. You do not know me." "No." "And yet you rode out here on your day off to tell me you want to court me." "Yes." She turned and looked at him, and this time the almost smile had arrived fully, though she was clearly working to keep it from being quite as large as it wanted to be. "You are either very honest or very bold," she said. "I am hoping both," he said. "Come to supper on Wednesday," she said. "Caleb will be here. We will talk more and I will decide whether you are as honest as you think you are." He stood, put his hat on, and nodded. "Wednesday," he said. "Thank you, Miss Wilcox." "Martha," she said. "If you are going to come to supper, you should use my name." "Martha," he said, and the word felt in his mouth like something he had been about to say for a long time without knowing it. He rode back to the Hendricks ranch with the kind of lightness in his chest that he would not have known how to describe if anyone had asked him, and which he privately decided not to examine too closely for fear that examining it would make it go away. The Wednesday supper was the beginning of what became, over the following weeks, a series of Sunday afternoon visits and the occasional Wednesday evening, during which Raymond and Martha talked with the increasing ease of two people who were discovering, to their mutual surprise, that the world as each of them saw it was remarkably similar in the ways that mattered most. Caleb served as a cheerful, imperfectly discreet chaperone, asking Raymond questions about cattle drives and the Rocky Mountains with a young man's enthusiasm that both of them appreciated for the way it smoothed the early-stage awkwardness of two people feeling their way toward each other. Martha learned that Raymond had grown up in Missouri, same as her father, on a farm that had failed when he was 12, after which his family had fragmented in the way that hard times fragmented families. His mother had died of fever when he was 15. His father had eventually taken up with a new woman in Kansas City, and the correspondence between them had grown infrequent and finally stopped. Raymond had gone west and made himself into a man through work, which was the oldest story in the territory and no less real for being common. Raymond learned that Martha had taken on the management of the Wilcox farm 3 years ago when her father died, and that in those 3 years she had paid off a small debt, expanded the corn crop, added the hog pen, and maintained the property without once asking the county or anyone in Silver Creek for help. He learned that she had read every book she could get her hands on, that she had opinions about local water rights and territorial law that were better informed than most county officials, and that she could ride as well as she could walk and had done so since she was 6 years old. He learned that she had turned down Harlan Greer not only because she did not love him, but because there had been something in Greer's proposal that had felt less like a question and more like an assumption, as though he had already decided the outcome and was simply informing her of it, and that the only response she had been able to make that felt true was no. He told her this made complete sense to him. She told him she had not previously met a man who thought so. One Sunday in late June, Raymond helped her and Caleb repair a section of fence on the west side of the property that had partially collapsed after a hard rain. It was physical work, not the kind of work associated with courtship, but Martha had mentioned the fence and Raymond had simply shown up with tools and the knowledge of how to use them. And afterward they sat on the porch in the long summer evening and watched the light go golden over the mountains, and Martha brought out cold coffee, and they talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. When he rode back that evening, he realized that for the first time in his adult life, somewhere felt like somewhere he wanted to be rather than somewhere he was passing through. The situation with Harlan Greer, which Raymond had been aware of as a kind of background weather since his arrival in Silver Creek, became more directly relevant in early July. He was in town on a Saturday afternoon at the general store when Greer walked in. Raymond had seen Greer before at a distance, the big iron-haired man moving through town with the confidence of someone who owned enough of it to feel proprietary. But this was the first time they had been in the same room. Greer bought what he needed and was heading for the door when he paused and looked at Raymond with an assessment that was not quite recognition. "You are the Hendricks man," Greer said, not quite a question. "Raymond Slater," Raymond said. "Yes." Greer looked at him a moment longer. "I have heard your name somewhere," he said, and his eyes narrowed slightly, and Raymond knew, with a certainty based on years of reading the social weather of small towns, that Greer had heard his name in connection with Martha Wilcox's. "I could not say where," Raymond said pleasantly. Greer held his gaze for a moment and then left without another word, and Raymond felt the first small chill of the awareness that powerful men in small towns did not respond well to being reminded of their embarrassments. The following week, Clara Bowman stopped Martha at the dry goods store and told her, with the relish of someone who genuinely believes they are delivering necessary information, that Harlan Greer had been asking questions about the Hendricks ranch hand who had been spending his Sundays at the Wilcox farm. Martha relayed this to Raymond that Wednesday evening with a matter-of-fact calm that did not quite conceal the tightness underneath. "He may try to make trouble," she said. "I want you to know that, and I want you to understand that whatever he does, it is not your doing and not your fault." "What kind of trouble?" Raymond asked. "He has influence with Hendricks," she said. "They do business together. I do not know what that means in practical terms." Raymond nodded slowly. "If he pressures Hendricks to let me go, I will find other work," he said. "That is not the end of the world." "It is not," she agreed. "But I do not want you to lose your position because of something that is between him and me." "Martha," he said, and the directness in her name was the same directness with which he always approached her. "I am not concerned about Harlan Greer's opinions about where I spend my Sundays, and I am not here because I do not have other options. I am here because I want to be here. That does not change because he is uncomfortable with it." She looked at him for a long moment, and there was something in her face that he had not seen there before, something that was not quite vulnerability exactly, but was somewhere in that direction, a softening of the composure that she wore like armor. "I am not easy to be around," she said. "People tell me so. I am too direct and I have too many opinions and I do not pretend things are different than they are." "I know," he said. "Those are the things I like best about you." Martha looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at her hands, and then she looked out the window at the dark fields, and when she looked back at him her eyes were very clear. "I am beginning to think," she said carefully, "that this is becoming something." "Yes," he said. "I am not frightened of that," she said. "I want you to know that I am not frightened of it." "Good," he said. "Neither am I." They did not touch that evening, not because the impulse was not there, but because they were both people who took things seriously, who understood that the things you rushed rarely held. But when he left and she stood in the doorway watching his horse disappear into the summer dark, she was aware that something had fundamentally shifted, that the farm and the life she had built and the future she had imagined for herself had acquired a different shape than it had possessed before. The trouble from Harlan Greer arrived in the second week of July, though it came in a form nobody had predicted. Greer did not go to Hendricks, which had been Martha's fear. Instead, he went to the county land office, where he had long-standing relationships, and he raised a question about the eastern boundary of the Wilcox property, suggesting that the survey from the original claim might have been improperly recorded, and that a strip of land along the eastern fence line that included the best section of the corn crop might in fact fall within the boundaries of an adjacent parcel that Greer had recently acquired. The claim was not obviously false. The original survey of the Wilcox property had been done in 1868, 10 years prior, and the documentation was, in the way of frontier survey documentation, not as precise as it might have been. Greer was not saying Martha had done anything wrong. He was simply raising a question, in the careful way of men with lawyers, and the question had the effect of freezing the status of the eastern field until the matter could be resolved. Martha came to town to see the county recorder and came back with a face that was set in careful lines. Caleb was furious. He wanted to go to Greer's office and say things that Raymond, when he heard the plan, strongly advised against. "That will not help anything," Raymond said. They were sitting at the kitchen table, all three of them on a Thursday evening. "Greer is looking for a reaction. Giving him one gives him more to work with." "The corn in that field is half our summer income," Martha said. She was not emotional about it. She was stating a fact which Raymond thought was possibly more worrying than if she had been angry. "If we cannot harvest it, we cannot pay the winter bills." "Who is the best lawyer in Silver Creek?" Raymond asked. "There is only one lawyer in Silver Creek," Martha said. "Thomas Yates. He is competent, but he charges what he knows people can pay, which is more than we can pay right now." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "I have been putting aside from my wages," he said. "I have a small savings, not much, but enough for legal fees probably." Martha looked at him with an expression that was immediately and clearly a refusal. "I will not take your money," she said. "I know you will not take it as a gift," he said. "I am not offering it as one. I am offering it as a loan, to be paid back when the harvest comes in, with whatever interest you think is fair." Martha held his gaze for a long moment. He could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the pride against the practicality, the independence she had worked so hard for against the reality of what refusal would cost her. 10%, she said finally, "and a written agreement." "Agreed," he said. Caleb, who had been watching this exchange with open fascination, said, "Martha, you are negotiating interest rates with the man who is trying to court you." "If you have a more sensible suggestion, Caleb, I am listening," Martha said, with a sweetness that was entirely dry. Caleb decided he did not. Thomas Yates was, as Martha had said, competent, and with Raymond's savings to cover his fees, he applied himself to the boundary question with the methodical attention of a man who liked finding out that other men's claims were wrong. He requested the original survey documentation, cross-referenced it with the territorial land grant records in Santa Fe, and spent 2 weeks corresponding with the county surveyor's office. During those 2 weeks, Raymond continued his ranch work and his Sunday visits and the occasional Wednesday evening, and what existed between him and Martha deepened the way things deepen when people go through something together. Not dramatically, not in a single moment, but steadily and surely, like water finding its way into stone. One evening he arrived to find Martha not in the garden or on the porch, but sitting at the kitchen table with the farm account spread in front of her, and he sat down across from her without being asked, and they went through the numbers together, because 4 eyes are better than 2, and because she was smart enough to know that pride which prevented problem-solving was not a virtue but a disadvantage. "You are good at this," she said, watching him add a column of figures. I have always been better with numbers than people expect a cowboy to be, he said. Where did you learn? My mother taught me, before she died. She used to say that a man who could not keep his own books was dependent on other people's honesty, and that other people's honesty was not something you could rely on. Martha looked at him with the soft warmth that she was beginning to allow herself to show more freely. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was, he said. You would have liked each other. He had not meant it quite as much as it meant, but when he heard himself say it, he knew it was true, and he also knew, from the way Martha's expression changed, that she understood what he was saying underneath what he was saying. There were nights he lay awake in his bunk at the Hendricks Ranch and thought about the shape of a future that he had never previously considered as a concrete thing. He was 31 years old and had been moving for 14 years, and movement had been fine, had been more than fine, had been the right thing for the person he had been. But somewhere between the first sight of Martha Wilcox arguing about corn prices and the Thursday evening at her kitchen table going over farm accounts, he had become a different person, or perhaps more precisely, he had become the person he had always been capable of becoming, but had not yet had sufficient reason to become. Thomas Yates won the boundary dispute in the third week of August. The original survey had been correct, and the strip of land Greer claimed fell within it by a margin of 43 feet that was entirely unambiguous once the proper documentation was produced. The county recorder formally closed the question and sent a letter to Greer's lawyers informing them of the determination. Martha read the letter twice when it arrived, and then she set it down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. "It is done," Caleb said. "It is done," she agreed. She paid Raymond back 2 weeks later when the eastern corn field came in full with the 10% interest precisely calculated. He tried to decline the interest, and she gave him a look that made him stop trying. The Saturday after the legal matter was resolved, Raymond rode into town on an errand that was not, precisely, an errand. He went to the general store and spent a careful amount of time looking at a particular item in the glass case, and then he made his purchase and carried it back to the ranch and sat with it for 2 days thinking. He had known what he wanted. He had known it for longer than he had been willing to admit to himself, because certainty about a thing like this was not something that arrived all at once, but something that accumulated. And he had been accumulating it since a Friday evening by a fire west of Silver Creek, when a man named Cobb told a story about a woman who had said no to the richest man in the county. He rode to the Wilcox farm on the following Sunday afternoon in the first week of September, when the New Mexico heat was beginning to soften at the edges, and the light had taken on the long golden quality of early autumn. The corn in the eastern field was already in, and the sweet potato harvest would begin in 2 more weeks, and the farm had the prosperous and slightly tired look of a property at the end of a good season. Martha was on the porch when he arrived, which was not unusual, but she was not working, which was. She was simply sitting, looking west at the mountains, with a glass of water in her hand. She looked up when he rode in, and there was something in her face that was different from its usual expression, something more open, as though the resolution of the summer's difficulty had allowed her to put down something she had been carrying. He tied his horse. He came up the porch steps. He sat in his customary chair, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and then he said without preamble, because there was no other way he knew how to do things, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the small item he had purchased at the general store, a simple gold band that the storekeeper had ordered from Santa Fe because Silver Creek did not have a jeweler, but Clara Bowman's husband had a connection in the capital who could source such things. He set it on the small table between their chairs. Martha looked at it. Then she looked at him. "Raymond," she said. "I know," he said. "It has not been long. I know what people would say. People have been saying things about me for some time," she said. "I have stopped tracking their opinions." "Martha," he said, and leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, looking at her with the full weight of everything he meant. I am not a wealthy man. I have 17 acres of savings, a good horse, and my reputation for work. I cannot offer you what Greer offered you. What I can offer you is a full partnership in the honest sense of the word, someone who is on your side in every room and every circumstance, and who intends to build something here with you rather than simply providing for you. I want to be here. I want this to be the place I stop moving, and I want that to be with you. The mountains were very clear in the September light, and the air smelled like cut grass and distant rain, and Martha Wilcox sat in her porch chair and looked at Raymond Slater with eyes that were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "You know what I did when Harlan Greer proposed," she said. "I heard about it," he said, with the smallest possible hint of a smile. "He offered me everything a practical woman should want," she said, "and I told him no, and everyone thought I was a fool." "I know," Raymond said. "I told him no because I could not imagine loving him," she said. "I could not imagine looking at him across a table and thinking, there is the person I chose. I could not imagine being known by him." She paused. "I can imagine those things with you." Raymond was very still. "Yes," Martha said. It was the simplest yes she had ever spoken, and it was the largest thing either of them had ever heard in that quiet afternoon. And he picked up the ring from the table and put it on her finger, and her hand was warm and strong in his, and she looked down at it and then up at him, and when she smiled it was the fullest smile he had yet seen on her face, the one that took over entirely. "You should know," she said, "that I will continue to run this farm on my own terms." "I know," he said, "I would not expect otherwise, and I will continue to charge fair prices for my corn, as you should. And if you have opinions about how things are done here, I am open to hearing them, but not to being overruled." "I understand partnership," he said. "I have been proposing it since July." She laughed then, a real laugh, and he thought it was the best sound he had heard in a very long time. Caleb was told that evening. He received the news with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been waiting for it, and had in fact been privately rooting for the outcome since approximately the second Sunday visit, which neither Raymond nor Martha had suspected, and which Caleb was too gracious to point out more than twice. They set the wedding for the first Saturday of October, which gave them a month's notice and was, Martha said, more than adequate time for a sensible wedding. She was not interested in a large production. She wanted the Reverend and a few friends and a good meal afterward, and Raymond, who had been to enough weddings of various sizes to have opinions about the relative merits of simplicity, agreed that this was the correct approach. The news moved through Silver Creek with its customary speed. The reaction was more complicated than Raymond had expected. Most people seemed genuinely pleased, or at least not displeased. Clara Bowman said it was too fast. Reverend Aldgate said it was good to see Miss Wilcox settled. Abe Dawson bought Raymond a drink at the saloon and told him he was a lucky man in the way that men who are not particularly lucky themselves congratulate men who are. Harlan Greer said nothing publicly. He was seen in town twice in the following weeks, and he was civil in the way that a powerful man is civil when he has decided to be, which is to say without warmth but without visible hostility either. Raymond thought he was a man who had taken a loss and had chosen dignity over protest, which was more than some men would have done, and he thought no worse of him than he had before. One Sunday afternoon in late September, a week before the wedding, Raymond and Martha rode out together on horseback to the eastern edge of her property, the field that had been the subject of Greer's claim. The corn was all in now, and the field was bare and golden brown in the autumn light, and they sat on their horses at the fence line and looked across it. "This is what he wanted to take," Martha said. "He did not get it," Raymond said. "No," she agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking about the spring planting," she said. "If we clear the section north of the barn, we could expand the sweet potato crop and maybe add some winter wheat. The soil there is good." Raymond looked where she was pointing, assessing the ground with a rancher's practical eye. "The irrigation would need work," he said, but it is manageable. I was thinking we could do it in February, she said. After the cold breaks. We, he said. She looked at him and the word hung between them warm and solid. We, she confirmed. He reached over from his horse and took her hand, and they sat together in the October almost light and looked at the land that was going to be theirs together, and neither of them needed to say anything else. The first Saturday of October 1878 arrived clear and cold, with a sky of pure blue that arched over Silver Creek like something that had been arranged on purpose. Martha wore a dress she had made herself, a deep blue-green that matched nothing in her wardrobe and everything about the day, with her dark hair pinned up in her mother's small pearl earrings, which were the only jewelry she owned besides the gold ring Raymond had given her. Raymond wore his best clothes, which were not extravagant but were clean and pressed, and accompanied by a new shirt he had purchased in town at a price that had made him wince slightly, though not enough to reconsider. Reverend Aldgate performed the ceremony in the church with the peeling paint, which had been freshly whitewashed on the inside for the occasion, by a congregation that seemed to have decided this wedding was worth the effort. The witnesses were Caleb, who stood beside his sister with an expression of such tender pride that several people nearby found themselves unexpectedly emotional, and a man named Webb who had been working alongside Raymond at the Hendricks Ranch and had become, in the easy way of men who work together, a reliable friend. The vows they spoke were the traditional ones, but the way they said them was not traditional at all, because they looked at each other with the full directness that had characterized their entire acquaintance, two people who did not believe in averting their eyes from things that were real. And when Raymond said the words, they felt true in his mouth, and when Martha said them, her voice was clear and steady and warm all the way through. The meal afterward was at the Wilcox farm, which Martha and Caleb had prepared over 2 days, with contributions from several of the neighboring farm women, who had taken a liking to the whole business, and showed up with roasted chickens and corn pudding, and a pie that Clara Bowman had made somewhat against her principles but had made well, because Clara Bowman could not bake badly even when she was skeptical about the occasion. The afternoon stretched into evening, and there was fiddle music provided by a man named Archibald who had 3 fingers on his left hand, and could play better with those 3 fingers than most men could play with 10. And people danced in the yard in the autumn dark, and Raymond danced with his wife, which was a word that sat in his mind as though it had always been there waiting to be used, and Martha laughed when he stepped on her foot, and he laughed when she stepped on his. And the mountains in the west held the last of the daylight long after the yard was lit by lanterns. After everyone had gone and Caleb had gone to bed, they sat on the porch in the quiet, and the stars over New Mexico were extraordinary in the way they were always extraordinary to people who had lived their whole lives within the distance of buildings and forgot, until they were faced with open country, that the sky went on that far. "Well," Martha said. "Well," Raymond agreed. "I should tell you something," she said. "I was frightened before today." "Of what?" he asked. "Of being wrong," she said. "I said no to Greer because I trusted myself, and I had nothing to compare the feeling to. When you came along, I had something to compare it to. And I was frightened that comparing would make me doubt." And he said, "And it did not," she said. "If anything, it made me more certain, because with him there was nothing to doubt. There was never a question of love or not love, because there was never a beginning of love to evaluate. With you," she paused, "with you it was different from the first conversation. And that frightened me, because something worth having is also something worth losing." Raymond turned to look at her. In the lantern light she was warm and vivid and more entirely herself than anyone he had ever known. "You are not going to lose it," he said. "I know," she said. "I have decided I am not frightened anymore." He took her hand, and they sat for a while longer in the cool October air, and then they went inside, and the stars went on overhead without them, which the stars were accustomed to doing. The first full year of their marriage was a working year, as the first years on a farm always are, full of the practical reality of 2 people integrating their lives and their methods and their opinions. There were disagreements, because they were both people with opinions, and the disagreements were sometimes heated, because they were also both people who did not back down from things they believed. But the disagreements were always resolved, because they had agreed early on that going to bed angry was a poor habit, and that whatever needed to be said could be said plainly, and then put to rest. Raymond formally left the Hendricks Ranch in November and took on the management of the Wilcox farm as a full partner. He brought to it the stockman's knowledge of animal husbandry and the rancher's eye for land use that complemented Martha's crop expertise. And in the spring of 1879, they cleared the northern section and put in the winter wheat she had planned, along with an expanded sweet potato crop and a small apple orchard that Raymond had been thinking about since he first looked at the northern field and noticed the soil drainage. The apple orchard would not produce for several years, but Raymond was a man who had learned to think in longer time frames than the next cattle drive, and Martha, when he explained his reasoning, understood it immediately and approved of it, and added 2 more trees to his plan. Caleb, who had turned 20 by spring, was a capable and willing partner in the farm work, and he and Raymond developed the easy camaraderie of men who respect each other's competence and are glad of each other's company. He was also, by spring, showing an interest in a young woman named Anna Reyes, whose family had a vegetable farm to the north, and this interest was sufficiently mutual that by summer it had become an understanding, and by the following spring it became a betrothal. Martha watched her brother's happiness with a warmth that reminded Raymond, observing her observe this, of the way she looked at everything she cared about, with a kind of fierce, quiet pride. In February of 1880, Raymond came in from the barn one morning to find Martha at the kitchen table with a particular stillness that he had learned to recognize as significant, the stillness of someone who is holding something important very carefully. She looked up at him, and there was in her face something new, something he had never seen there before, a wonder that was also certainty. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen with his coat still on and his hat in his hands and looked at his wife, and the feeling that moved through him was too large to be called anything specific, too various to be named with one word. It was joy, certainly, and it was the particular terror of joy, the understanding that happiness of this magnitude comes attached to proportional vulnerability, and it was something else underneath those things, a sense of completion that was not an end but a foundation. He crossed the kitchen and sat across from her and took her hands. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said, and smiled at him, and it was the smile he had first fully seen on the day he proposed and which she wore more freely now, the one that took over her whole face. "I am quite well." The summer of 1880 was warm and productive. The farm prospered in the way that farms prosper when they are worked with both knowledge and love. The wheat came in well, the sweet potato crop was the best they had produced, and the corn fields were thriving. Martha continued to run her Thursday market until July, when the heat and the advanced pregnancy made the wagon ride into town less practical, and Raymond took over the market sales with a thoroughness that she supervised from home, by sending him with a written list of prices from which he was not to deviate. He did not deviate. The baby arrived in September of 1880, a boy with dark hair and Martha's amber eyes and Raymond's jaw, which was the first thing Raymond noticed, and which made Caleb, who was present for reasons of practical necessity, laugh with a warmth that filled the house. They named him Elias after Martha's father. Raymond held his son for the first time in the rocking chair beside the bedroom window, and the boy looked up at him with the unfocused certainty of the newly born, and Raymond held him very carefully and understood something about permanence that he had not previously understood, which was that the things you build over time, slowly and honestly and in full view of the truth, are the things that hold. Martha watched them from the bed, tired and clear-eyed and so completely herself that it struck Raymond, looking over at her, as the most remarkable thing he had seen in a life that had lately become remarkable on a regular basis. "He has your forehead," she said. "He has your eyes," he said. "He has a great deal to live up to," she said, with a quiet gravity that was also, underneath, completely and warmly amused. "He will manage," Raymond said. Silver Creek grew over the following years in the way that western towns grew when the territory was developing. The railroad came through in 1882, which changed the commercial character of the county significantly. It made the cattle business easier and the agricultural market wider. And for the Wilcox Slater farm, which was what people now called it, it meant access to markets in Albuquerque and beyond for their produce, and eventually, when the apple trees began to bear in 1884, for their fruit. Harlan Greer sold his silver works in 1883 and moved to Denver, which surprised people until they thought about it and then did not. He had expanded as far as Silver Creek would allow, and Denver was a larger stage. Before he left, he encountered Raymond at the post office, and the exchange between them was brief and entirely civil. "You did well out at the Wilcox place," Greer said. "We both worked hard," Raymond said. Greer nodded once with the look of a man settling an account. "She is a capable woman," he said. "She is," Raymond said, "the most capable I have ever known." Greer put his mail under his arm and said good day, and that was the last Raymond saw of him, and the matter which had cast a shadow at the beginning was fully in the past now, where it belonged. Little Elias learned to walk in the spring of 1881 and spent the following 2 years at a near run, pursuing everything on the farm with the determined curiosity that his parents recognized as familiar and which exhausted them in the best possible way. He had his father's instinct for animals and his mother's instinct for everything that grew, and by the time he was 3, he was following both of them around the farm with a seriousness that made everyone who saw it smile. In the spring of 1882, Martha became pregnant again, and this time it was easier than the first, or at least she said it was, though Raymond remained of the opinion that she minimized difficulty on principle, and that the truth was somewhat more complicated. Their second child was a girl, born in November, with Raymond's dark hair and a set to her chin that suggested she had arrived with opinions already formed. They named her Clara, which had nothing to do with Clara Bowman of the dry goods store, but which was the name of Raymond's grandmother, who had been, by his account, a formidable woman, and so it seemed to fit. Caleb and Anna were married in the fall of 1882, and they built a house on the north section of the Wilcox property that Raymond and Caleb constructed together over the summer, a solid 2-room house with a good chimney and a window that faced east to catch the morning light. Anna was warm and capable, and had a sense of humor that was dry as the New Mexico summer, and she and Martha got on with the immediate ease of 2 women who recognize each other as the same kind of person. The Thursday market continued to be Martha's. Raymond had offered to take it on permanently to spare her the drive, but she had declined in the tone she used for things that were not negotiable. The market was hers. She had built its reputation and its customer relationships, and she intended to keep them. He did not argue. He drove the wagon and helped load and unload and stepped back when they arrived on Main Street, and she took over with the authority of long custom. There were hard years, as there always are. The drought of 1884 was severe, and the creek ran low and the corn suffered, and they pulled through it on the winter wheat reserves and the apples, which needed less water than the corn, and on the savings Raymond had been building with the same steadiness he applied to everything. He had learned from his mother and confirmed by years of experience that the time to prepare for bad years is during the good ones, and he had never stopped preparing. Martha, during the drought, wrote a letter to the Territorial Land Office about water rights and creek allocation that was, by the accounts of people who saw the reply, so precisely argued and so well evidenced that the official who received it showed it to 2 colleagues, one of whom later cited it in a report to the territorial government on agricultural water management. Raymond read the letter before she sent it and told her it was the best written thing he had ever read. And he meant it. And she thanked him with the particular gratitude of a person who does not receive that kind of recognition often and takes it seriously when they do. Their third child arrived in 1886, a boy named Thomas, who had Martha's amber eyes and a disposition so sunny that it sometimes seemed impossible that he and Clara could share parents, given that Clara had arrived with opinions, and Thomas arrived with contentment. He was not simple, not by any measure, but he had a happiness that was his baseline rather than his achievement, and watching that was, Raymond thought, one of the most educational things he had encountered as a parent. Elias, by 1886, was 6 years old and entirely convinced that he was going to be a rancher when he grew up, a conviction he held with such consistency and clarity that Raymond had stopped worrying about whether it was a phase. The boy could ride. He had been on a horse since he was 3, sitting in front of Raymond on the saddle, and by 5 he was riding the gentle mare on his own with a confidence that was neither reckless nor uncertain but simply appropriate, which was exactly what you wanted. The farm expanded again in 1887 when they purchased the adjacent parcel to the east, which had come available when its owner, an older farmer named Patterson, decided to move to Arizona to live with his daughter. Raymond negotiated the price, and Martha went over the survey documents line by line before she would agree to sign anything, which Patterson found either admirable or exhausting, depending on which day he was asked. The purchase doubled their arable land and gave them access to a secondary water source that improved their irrigation options considerably. Raymond spent much of the following year planning the expansion of the sweet potato crop and the addition of a second corn field, while Martha managed the accounts and the market relationships with the same precise attention she had always given them. Clara Bowman came to the farm in the summer of 1887, ostensibly to buy sweet potatoes, but actually, as Martha recognized immediately, to convey the town's general opinion that the Wilcox Slater farm was the most productive agricultural operation in the county, which was true, and that it was remarkable what Martha had done with the place, which was also true, and which Clara managed to say in a way that only partially obscured the fact that she was also conceding that her original assessment of Martha's judgment had been incorrect. Martha accepted the compliment with complete composure and sold her the sweet potatoes at the regular price. She told Raymond about it that evening, and he laughed, which was one of the things she loved most about him, the way he laughed at the right things with the right quality of understanding. "You could have been gracious about it," he said. "I was gracious," she said. "I sold her the sweet potatoes at the regular price. Another woman might have charged her extra." This produced more laughter, which was exactly what she had intended. In the autumn of 1887, Raymond built a new porch on the house, larger and sturdier than the original, with a proper railing and a roof overhang that kept the afternoon rain off. He built it himself over 3 weekends with Caleb's help, and when it was done, Martha stood on it and looked west at the mountains that had been the view from this property since she was a child. The same mountain she had watched turn gold in the evening light on the day Raymond had come to tell her he wanted to court her, and she thought about the distance between that afternoon and this one, and found it was both very long and not long at all. Raymond came up behind her and stood beside her, and she leaned slightly into his shoulder, which was a thing she had taken to doing without deciding to, because he was warm and solid, and it was good to lean sometimes, when you spent most of your life holding yourself upright by your own effort. "The mountains are the same," she said. "The mountains are always the same," he agreed. "Everything else is different." He looked out at the farm, at the expanded fields and the new apple trees that were now producing steadily, and the barn that had been repaired and re-roofed in the spring, and the house that had grown with them, with additions and improvements that marked the years the way rings mark the years of a tree. "Better," he said. "Better," she agreed. Clara was 5 in 1887, and she had developed a ferocious interest in arithmetic that nobody had anticipated, but that Martha, watching her daughter work through the farm accounts on the days when Martha brought them out, recognized as familiar. Raymond quietly purchased a mathematics primer from the dry goods store, and Clara worked through it in 6 weeks and asked for another one. "She is going to be something unexpected," Raymond said one evening. "She already is," Martha said. Little Thomas was 1 year old in 1887, placid and cheerful and entirely untroubled by his sister's intellectual ambitions, which he regarded with the sunny tolerance of someone who had enough good nature to extend to everyone around him without running short. The years settled into their shape. The farm continued to grow. The children continued to grow faster. Elias turned 10 in 1890 and began riding with Raymond on the eastern pasture, where they kept a small herd of cattle that Raymond had started building in 1885, a modest beginning that had become, by 1890, a respectable if not large cattle operation running alongside the agricultural business. He was a boy of quiet competence, which was perhaps inevitable given his parents, and watching him was for both of them a continuous source of the particular joy that comes from seeing a person become thoroughly themselves. Caleb and Anna had children of their own. The North House was expanded twice. The two families shared the farm's operations in a partnership that ran on trust and practicality, and the deep affection between siblings that survives the specific turbulence of shared history and comes out the other side strengthened by it. On a Sunday morning in October of 1892, 14 years from the autumn of 1878, when Raymond had ridden into Silver Creek on nothing but curiosity and honesty, Martha sat at the kitchen table while the children were at church with Caleb and Anna, and she wrote a letter. She had been asked by the new county recorder to provide her recollection of the 1878 boundary dispute, which was being used as a precedent in a current land case, and she was providing it with the same precision and clarity she brought to everything. Raymond sat across from her with a cup of coffee, reading the previous week's newspaper that had come in on the Thursday stage, and the kitchen was full of the particular Sunday morning quiet of a house where everyone who is going to be noisy is temporarily elsewhere. She looked up from her writing and looked at him, and he looked up from his newspaper and looked at her, and the looking between them was the same looking that it had always been, direct and warm and full of the accumulated weight of everything they knew about each other, which by now was nearly everything there was. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just looking at you." "Any particular reason?" she considered. "I was thinking about the first time I saw you," she said. "You came to buy corn, and you told me in the same breath that you had come because of a story you had heard about me, and that you thought it was remarkable what I had done." "I remember," he said. "I thought you were either very honest or very bold," she said. "I believe those were your exact words," he said. "I remember because I told you I was hoping to be both." "You were both," she said. "You are both." He set down his newspaper. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window in the golden way of autumn mornings, and it lay across the table and across the letter she was writing and across her hands, which were still strong, still marked by work, still the hands of a woman who did everything she did with her full self. "You know," she said, "that I think about it sometimes. What would have happened if you had not ridden into Silver Creek? If you had heard the story about me and Greer and just stayed by the fire and moved on?" "I could not have done that," he said. "You did not know me," she said. "No," he said, "but I knew the kind of woman who would do a thing like that, and I knew that I wanted to know more." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she reached across the table and he took her hand, and they sat together in the Sunday morning kitchen with their 14 years of marriage and their children who had come home, loud from church, and their farm that was bigger and more prosperous than either of them had imagined alone. And the mountains were still visible through the window, the same mountains, unchanged. "Are you glad," she asked, "that you were curious?" "Martha," he said, with a quiet warmth that carried everything. "I am glad of everything that led me to that Thursday morning on Main Street. I am glad of every mile between the DeWitt Cattle Camp and Silver Creek, and I am glad every single day that you said yes." She squeezed his hand. "I am glad I said yes too," she said. "I am glad I knew the difference between the question I was being asked before and the question worth saying yes to." "Harlan Greer asked you a question without knowing you," Raymond said. "And you asked me a question that was already about knowing me," she said. "That was the difference." The Sunday morning held them in its particular quiet, and outside the farm was golden in the autumn light, the apple trees full with the season's last fruit, the fields at rest after harvest, the barns solid and familiar, the mountains unchanging in the west, and everywhere around them the life that two people build when they choose each other for the right reasons. Not because it is practical, not because the other person solves the immediate problem, but because they see each other clearly. And choose each other anyway, and keep choosing every day in the 1,000 ordinary ways that constitute a life. When the children came home from church, loud and enthusiastic and trailing Caleb and Anna and their own small brood behind them, they found their parents at the kitchen table, still talking, the way they were always talking, the letter still half-written and the coffee long cold, and the look between them that the children had grown up with and did not have a name for, which was simply the look of two people who are exactly where they are supposed to be. Elias, who was 12 and beginning to understand things about adults that he was not yet old enough to fully articulate, looked at his parents for a moment before he hung up his coat, and something in what he saw lodged in him and would stay there, a picture he would carry for the rest of his life of what it looked like when two people had built something true. Clara sat down at the table immediately and asked her mother about the letter and her father about the newspaper, and proceeded to have both conversations simultaneously, which was completely characteristic of her. And Thomas climbed onto Raymond's lap and fell asleep within 10 minutes, which was completely characteristic of him. And the kitchen filled with voices and the warmth of a family in full, particular, irreducible life. Raymond sat in his chair with his sleeping son and his lively daughter and the sound of Martha's voice talking to Elias about the harvest accounts, and the knowledge that all of this, was the answer to a curiosity he had carried on a 12-mile ride 14 years ago, and the answer was better than any question he had known how to ask. The farm would go on. The children would grow. The mountains would remain. And in Silver Creek, when people told the story of Martha Wilcox, who had turned down the richest man in the county, they told it the way they told good stories, with the understanding that the best part was not the refusal but everything that came after it. The cowboy who heard about it and came to ask why, and the woman who looked at him and decided he was worth answering, and the life they had made together on a piece of New Mexico land that was entirely, completely, and forever their own.